Hello everyone. Welcome back to another episode of the podcast this week. I'm just here re-recording the introduction to give you all a little bit of a heads up about my recording microphone, which, as it turned out, as we were recording the rest of the podcast, was playing up and spontaneously producing some rustling sounds. So it looks like I'm going to need to replace it. But I should let you know that there are some occasional sounds that don't occur too often throughout the episode, but if you hear these little leaf-like sounds, it is actually for me, so apologies about that. But moving on, and much more importantly, this week's episode welcomes on board someone whose research and collaborative interdisciplinary approach to music making has influenced my own practice since I attended her composition seminar at the Conservatoire of Sydney back in 2015. This is none other than prolific sound maker extraordinaire and currently Professor of Music at Monash University, composer and performer Professor Cat Hope. Described by the Gramaphone Magazine as one of Australia's most exciting and individual creative voices, Cat creates music, art, and performances that are conceptually driven, ranging from animated graphic scores for acoustic and electronic combinations and for improvisation, with a particular fascination with low-frequency sound. Paired with her research practice and her artistic direction of Decibel ensemble, Cat's academic research engages with contemporary Australian music, digital music, noise music, gender equity, and music technology. So I really have to say thank you so much for coming on board and for being so enthusiastic about being a podcast guest. Welcome, Cat.
I love what you're doing. I've listened to pretty much all of your series, I think. John Davis put me onto it, I think, when he did his. So I've really enjoyed all the different perspectives. It's a great project.
Well, thank you so much. Yes, I remember speaking with John. It must have been December of the year before the last. It was very fruitful and kind of really hopeful conversation.
But moving into what I'm certain is also going to be a hopeful conversation, I wanted to first ask you if you always knew that you wanted to be a sound maker.
No, I didn't. But when it happened, it was very certain. So I'd been fiddling around with different instruments. I think I learned guitar for a while. And then I kind of wanted to get more serious about music, and the teacher at my school said they needed flutes. So I started learning flute, and I kind of fell in love with music, I guess, at the end of high school. But I fell deeply and I was going to be a vet, and I suddenly changed everything to be a musician. And I have to say, I never felt very strongly about the flute as such, but I really loved being involved in music. And I had another moment of affirmation, I guess, if you like, of that dedication when I started getting interested in very low frequency sound. I kind of fell in love with sound all over again and realized that all this time I loved making sound, but I wasn't necessarily making the right one. So I changed tack a bit and focused on bass flute and bass guitar and electronic music. And as a that's kind of been part of my composition practice for quite a few years now.
So did you go out of studying the flute into composition immediately, or was it performance that eventually kind of led you to writing and experimenting?
It was songwriting, actually. So after my classical music degree completed, I did composition as a second study with Roger Smalley. But I didn't understand it, I have to admit. When I spent a lot of time on a project, I never seemed to do very well. But when I did something very quick late at night, it was always well received. And so it confused me, and I let it go. But then when I was living in Europe, I got involved in playing in bands as a bass player, and I started writing songs, and that led actually to improvisation. And then out of that, I started notating music and kind of became what you would consider to be a composer, I guess. But I'd always been interested in making music. I just didn't really have the right tools. And when I started really committing to graphic notation and some of the digital tools that can facilitate graphic notation, kind of push it in different directions. Once that was discovered again, I just wrote a lot of music. And that happened to me in about 2008.
Oh, brilliant. I actually remember when I was a student at the con doing my little studies in composition, you came and did a seminar as part of the composition series, I think in 2015. I remember you showing us all the processes of graphic notation. And up until that point, that was something I'd only really seen in textbooks. And perhaps because I was so young and I'd only seen kind of more conventional classical music performances, I hadn't gone to see a gig where graphic notation featured as heavily as the work you were showing to us. So it made a real difference because I remember sitting in that lecture and thinking, I used to improvise as a pianist, and then I kind of lost that because notation kind of forces you into a framework where you read what's given to you. And I felt like that bit of my practice was lost. And then after that lecture with you, I was like, I'm going to try and bring that back in again and find different languages to communicate a bit more space in the music. So thank you for that.
Oh, thank you for that comment. I mean, I think that graphic notation, though, does tend to be ghettoized into a open area. Like, graphic notation is more open than, let's say, common practice Western notation.
Mm-hmm.
But I would argue that it isn't always the case. And in my music particularly, it's just, as you probably heard me say in that presentation, the parameters that are fixed are different. And so my music notation is actually very controlling and, what was it, dictatorial or whatever, like traditional notation, but only different elements. So I've always thought that in traditional notation, things like dynamics, yes, you follow the score, but it's pretty open what you do, how you create dynamics, for example, or the timbre of notes is often relates to some kind of historic practice thing, but ultimately it's up to you, the color that you use and the textures you create. But in my notation, those things are very explicit, and time is very, very explicit. But pitch, which seems to be the focus of common practice notation, is much more open. It's not completely open, and that discovery for me as someone who I was making drawings for a long time of sound, I just didn't know how to coordinate them or share them with groups or play them. But that was very liberating for me when I actually acknowledged that this is still it's still a composition. It's not an open improvisation. That's because I guess of my training was very, I guess you would say, quite conservative. Just Roger Smalley was actually a very interesting experimental electronic composer earlier in his career, but I think moving and teaching in Perth kind of took that out of him, and I had to kind of unlearn it or something to start again.
And you found it again in Europe?
I did, and I found it. What happened really was when I kind of stumbled into academia, which is, it kind of pains me a little bit to say it because it's just so difficult now to get jobs in academia, but I kind of stumbled in, and when I revisited all those materials that I'd read as a student when I was teaching them myself, I suddenly found this validation of these ideas that I didn't see on the first pass, maybe. And I, reading about composers that I loved, like Giacinto Scelsi and Ligeti and Xenakis, I started to notice that actually these drawings I'd been making were remarkably similar to a lot of their music notation. Sometimes their drafts, or sometimes what they were trying to do with their conventional notation was kind of what I had managed to achieve with my graphic notation. And so that really spurred me on. Plus, I had some really great colleagues that supported that plight and facilitated it with different digital tech and programming ideas that kind of put my drawings into motion, which provided a way to actually play them as scores.
Which is so beautiful to be able to hear those images being, I don't know how to describe this, colored, I suppose, by sound and by music.
Yeah, well, I'd always heard them. Like, I heard these images in my head. I just couldn't work out how to kind of render them in live performance. So I tried a few different things, but it was really kind of getting these pictures that I'd made and putting them in motion across a playhead, like a point where everyone was reading at the same time. And it was really great. In fact, drawing on that early inspiration, I'm doing a project at the moment where I'm we're playing these Xenakis and Ligeti drawings that are actually coloured pencil drawings of pieces that they then went on to notation, and just comparing the difference, because I think it will be quite startling how similar they are. The drawing and the notation. They might be, they might start in a different place, but I think they will arrive in the same.
That's interesting. Well, I look forward to seeing that when it comes out. I'll be really intrigued to see how what the similarities are, or what jumps out as not similar. So what's that project called?
I'm working on it with someone who's helped me a lot as a composer, Lindsay Vickery, a colleague of mine in Perth. And yeah, it's a project for the Xenakis centenary. He's been a huge influence, and I'm a huge fan of his music. So yeah, it's just I don't do a lot of these kind of memory or dedication projects in my composition practice.
And what's the project called, or is it untitled at the moment?
It's untitled at the moment. I think it's just called Scorings and performing Xenakis as graphic notation or something like that.
Really?
But yeah, it's a bit in progress, and we're presenting it at the Xenakis Centenary Conference in Greece later this year.
I'm going to keep an eye out on that if it happens later this year. See if I can go see it. Well, you mentioned your move into academia and into research and into teaching. Was that always part of the plan? Because you mentioned kind of stumbling into it.
No, it was never the plan. So, I mean, like a lot of musicians, I didn't know. I just wanted to play music. When I did my degree, I didn't really know what I wanted to do after that. And I ended up playing in bands and playing bass in bands, but flute in other things kind of concurrently. No, but I've always been quite academic in the sense that even though, I did fine at uni. I did very well as a musician, maybe less well as my more academic subjects. But artistic research wasn't a thing back then, in the 80s when I went to uni. But it was really, I guess, I'd always been really intellectually engaged with music. So I read a lot. I read a lot about composers. I read a lot about music and philosophy and ideas. And I'd actually published a couple of papers without even without being in academia, which is probably quite rare, on film music. Actually, I thought that was what I was really interested in pursuing. But then when I did stumble into it, it was the right thing, because in some ways it enabled my practice to flourish in that I was able to experiment without having to worry about the financial consequences of that. I think that's harder now than it was back then, 15 years ago or whatever. But it definitely provided me with a place, and with facilities and colleagues that we could work together. And I remember, as a freelance artist, because I was a freelance artist for quite a long time, I had the flexibility and the ability to travel and whenever I wanted and apply for grants to help me, whereas my colleagues at the university were kind of bound by the teaching schedules, but then had access to all this great tech. So it was always this really weird kind of comparison. So I managed to combine all of those things in my academic career so far.
When you were a freelancer, because I suppose I am still a freelancer on the art side of things, how did you manage to get the freedom to experiment with things that were more technical, or with access to facilities that were just more difficult to?
I collaborate with my academic colleagues. That's how. And yeah, so I would loan stuff and go and hang out there after hours, and then I would also every now and then, I could apply for funding for development projects. It was difficult. I think I had some big ideas that probably, if I'd been in academia at that time, would have been more easily rendered real. But it was fine, and I liked living as an artist. I don't think there are many practicing artists in academia who don't go by past a week without wondering what it would be like just to be an artist again. But it's getting more and more precarious, as you'd know, to take on that freelance career.
Yes, especially now, I suppose. Well, yeah, especially out of these last 2 years. I'm curious as to now that we're talking about research in academia, from what I've understood, having read lots of your recent publications, a lot of your research has been about how culture's evolved in terms of all the intersections between digital art, improvisation, mixed media, even sound and art installations, as well as composition. I was wondering, now that you're also teaching it, how do you think the framework in terms of pedagogy has had to adapt in terms of an increasingly global and cross-cultural appetite in learning music?
It's a great question. And, you know, my publications are kind of, unlike a lot of academics, they're very disparate in that they, you know, I publish on gender in music, and I publish on animated notation and digital technology. And in the past, I published much more around digital art and sound installation and so on. But I've always been quite an activist. I've always been very political, and it's kind of crept into my music, but it's definitely crept into my academic life. And as a senior academic, I don't do as much teaching as I did before, but I was head of school at Monash University for 3.5 years, and I took that role incredibly seriously from the perspective that you just mentioned, in that how we have to change the way we teach music in these places which are funded by the people, and we should be making music for those people. Now that might sound very droll, but actually I really noticed that the environment of academia was very white, mostly men, but our students didn't look like that at all. And I went through a process of trying to change gender representation in both in the music that the students played, but also the artists and staff that were involved with the students. Signed the school up to the Key Change Pledge, which is a British initiative around 50-50 gender targets, and tried to broaden the concept of music history to be one of a living concept, rather than something that we look at from the outside towards the past. And that has been very challenging because there's a huge status quo. In fact, the Australian music scene is remarkably conservative when we compare it with other places. I mean, there, of course, are conservative streams all around the world, but in Australia, I felt that certain groups were particularly marginalised, and we were in denial about that. But also experimentation was particularly ghettoised. So I think we need to do things that change that. So it's the repertoire we teach, it's the context we provide for that repertoire, it's the way we deliver our materials, and our social responsibility to the diversity of communities there are in Australia. I'm a big supporter of music from the past, but it can't be the only music that we focus on. We have to really think about who are composers now, and what are they making, and how can we make avenues to facilitate other people to come in to make music. And I think that students are very aware. Most students, not all of them, but you know, depending on their background, most students are pretty much aware of this. And there's this kind of lag between the students that are coming in and the staff that are teaching. So it's kind of, and you know, that's understandable because it's generational. But I think there's this big decolonization project happening in music around the world. I feel that Canada has really led that in a meaningful way, but it's happening now in Australia too. So I think it's a really good thing. But unfortunately, in the current political climate, there's no new funds or new support to enable this change. And it's not like we're making new places for people to walk into. We're actually cutting out things to make space. And that's a difficult conversation to have. So I welcome the inclusivity. I've fought very hard to make the music program that I oversaw as inclusive and relatable to current life as possible. but there are challenges, with funding in the arts. So, someone like me who's in academia and art, and you, Victoria, you kind of get the worst of the two worst worlds in terms of support and infrastructure. Sometimes you kind of ride my bike around near where I live and you look at the facilities in the private schools and you're like, these are incredible. These students are going to come out of here and they're going to go, so where's the theatre? Where's the Conservatoire? Oh, there's only one in the CBD. Oh, there's another one, 30 kilometres that way. I mean, it's quite extraordinary what's happening in Australia culturally. So something needs to change.
And do you think it will change?
I think there's a slow but seismic shift. The challenge is to keep that shift going. Because if you look at other seismic shifts in society, like feminism, there's been problems with that continuity line. I think more people are getting on board. And once there is more of a kind of, what's the word? More people are the more people that agree that this is something that has to happen, the more powerful the change will be. But I do think that most people who have a lot of influence, for example, on a political arena, perhaps aren't as insightful in this regard as others that are kind of on the ground. There's still a lot of, there's a lot of, what's the word? Cultural baggage or European baggage around Australian music practice that's carried quite high up. And I think it's time to shake that off and try and understand a bit more about who we are as a people.
For this first intermission is a 2017 work by Cat entitled Caps Freed. This is a piece for piano and electronics, and this recording is from its world premiere at the Australasian Computer Music Conference in 2017. It is performed here by Gabriella Smart with electronics devised by Stuart James and overseen by Lindsay Vickery.
exactly. Even just looking at the kinds of, or the percentages of repertoire that we play in terms of classical music with the bigger major performing arts companies, they're so dramatic. So it'd be nice to see more local music, or more music that involves communities that are on the ground in Australia.
That's right. And I think there's this kind of notion that somehow people don't want to see it, but that's crazy. I mean, it's just a failure on the marketing part. That's all. I mean, you look at some of the crap that gets sold, it goes crazy. I mean, if you can sell, fidget spinners or whatever, you can definitely sell Australian music.
That's a great quote. That should go
on
on a
it's a terrible quote.
Yeah, I just thought of a question, because a number of times I've been critiqued for talking about classical music and politicizing it. So I wonder, what would you say to those who don't believe that art music or classical music is political, or that we should be talking about it in a political framework?
I'm going to be a bad academic here and not remember any quotes, but there's generally two thoughts, right? It's like art and politics should never mix. And then there's the other opinion, which is everything is political. If anything is funded by taxpayers' money, it is political, because we pay tax to the government. And what is the government? We vote. It's political. Now, if there's a whole bunch of people with philanthropy and they're doing their thing, it doesn't need to be political at all. But if we are using the money that people pay to the government through tax, that's a political call. So that would be my first answer. The second one is, it would be wonderful if there was some kind of magic barrier between politics and art making, but there's just not enough infrastructure. We've lost this kind of support for artists. Arts administrators are also struggling, and they don't, as much as they want to, I think it's very difficult for them to support artists in a way that they would like, or have done in the past. So that is making, I think, artists are kind of mobilizing in ways maybe that they haven't before, but not all artists, because, if you're a rank and file violinist in one of the state orchestras, you're going to have a very different perspective about art and politics than if you're a independent artist who's trying to get funding through the Australia Council. So I think that it really depends on where you're coming from and what you serve to gain from politicizing art. I really believe in art is for everyone, and I love Italian romantic opera. I also love experimental noise music. Now, why is it that one is played in sticky basements for $20 an hour and the other in taxpayer-funded concert halls with major performing arts organisation and people on a wage for an ongoing position? So some people might say, well, that's because no one likes the noise music, it's horrible. But actually, that's an extreme case. It's not always the reason. So I think that artists have often, I guess making art is a process of insight. And so often artists can be quite political because they see things. I think they perhaps look more carefully sometimes. When you do look carefully, it's very hard not to feel that you have to act. It's hard to walk away. I really believe in that saying, the standard you accept is the standard that you walk past. And it's very difficult to walk past some of these situations.
Yes, and I'm very, very grateful for you and the work that you do, because I know that you've been very outspoken about lots of political things. So thank you very, very much, because it's helped a lot of people, including me, and also set a pretty good example as well of how you can use your voice in political situations for the art community and for the community at large.
No, thank you. It's very kind. Not everybody likes it. Because, whenever you push up against the status quo gets nervous. And I don't blame them in an environment where they are going to lose something. I mean, we're working in a space where we're not going to just rise up and find a place. Someone has to step aside to make room for these things, unless something radical happens from a political agenda. But anyway, I didn't mean to talk about politics the whole time.
No, not at all. Well, I suppose I'll do a little segue into, I suppose, something that is still sort of political, but more artistic, which is I wanted to ask you about your opera Speechless. Just a quick overview for anyone who doesn't know that much information about it. It's an opera that's wordless, that you generated a graphic notation score from, and you not reacted, but it's generated from the 2014 Human Rights Commission project. I believe it's titled The Forgotten Children, and this is everything that the opera has come from and how you transformed, I suppose, a political document into a work of art, which then won the Art Music Award in 2020. I was curious as to both the process and how you managed to get a work of that intensity, something this powerful, performed onto stage. We mentioned opera very briefly before as to the difference between the romantic and the more experimental. How this managed to get so much force behind it.
Well, I'm a huge opera fan. I used to play in an opera orchestra as a flute player, but I would never write an opera like the operas I love. It goes back to what I said earlier about music for the people now. That means something to us. And operas have always treated big themes, big well, it's not humanitarian, but they're big human condition themes. And I guess going back to the politics very briefly, I was very frustrated at the situation in Australia, and I kind of couldn't work out what to do with the tools that I had. I'm not a nurse or a lawyer. I can't just go to a refugee camp or represent people pro bono or something like that. So I decided to try and make a work where I could create, I guess, encourage people to think about these difficult issues in a new way, and share my frustration, but also perhaps empower people to act. So the process of the opera, really, it was the report is this kind of generic government document. It's got a kind of graphic design. It's got drawings by refugee children in it and lots of graphs. And what I did is I kind of inverted the idea of libretto. As you said, there's no words in the opera, but I used the children's drawings, this color scheme of the graphic design, and these graphs as material for my graphic score. So the musicians kind of reread the document through this process. So because one thing I've learned is that kind of yelling at people about what's right and wrong isn't really effective, and that's really what was happening to Gillian Triggs when she presented that report to the Australian government. Tony Abbott just told her it was politicised and left. And I mean, you read the thing; it's a bunch of facts. So it took a long time. I started it when I was resident in the Peggy Glanville Hicks house. That gave me a bit of space away from academia to focus on this idea, and gradually over time chipped away at this piece. And it's a very culminative thing. It brings in lots of different things that I've done in the past. So my noise practice, my electronic music practice, kind of a lot of graphic scoring techniques that I've developed. The idea of sampling music in real time, that's a big part of a lot of my compositions. So really brought together a whole bunch of things. And with the support of my group, Decibel Music Ensemble, they kind of were in the orchestra helping. They were so familiar with my music and my scoring techniques. They were really great lever. But I'd worked a lot in Perth, where I spent most of my adult life, I guess, with Tour New Music, and they were fantastic supports of mine, and particularly of this project, and they helped me to get it off the ground. So funding applications, and then liaising with the Perth Festival to make the premiere in 2019. And I'm just in the process of organising a remount of it in Hamburg in 2023. So I'm thrilled, because it kind of happened at the time. Any remounts were just off the table because COVID was the next thing that happened. And I didn't do it in a conventional music way. I organized a kind of showing, a kind of development process of the music that wasn't staged in Adelaide with the help of Vital Statistics, a fantastic organization there. And then that kind of that enabled me to test this idea if I could create a piece of music that enables people to empathize with the issue. So if you listen to it as a piece of music, it's a piece of music. But if you know what it's about, if you read the program note, I think it really does empower people to think differently about this difficult thing and keep it on their mind. And in the actual premiere, when it was staged, we had Amnesty and refugee organisations at the concerts, giving talks, taking donations, or having forums and so on, so that if it did succeed, there was an opportunity for people to act or find out more about how they might engage with this issue and basically keep it alive so that people don't forget about these people in detention. And there's still, most children have been removed from detention in Australia, that's true. But there's still a lot of people in detention, as you've probably heard recently. In Melbourne after that whole business with detention hotels.
Yes.
Yeah,
I like that. Oh no, keep going.
Sorry. I think that's the story that you wanted to hear.
Well, I mean, I like that you invited all these organizations to be integrated into the way that the work is presented, because it allows it to be active and not just
goes beyond kind of virtual signaling and into action, perhaps. And then the other concept in the opera is that it's going back to this for the people concept. The idea is that in every place it's performed, the people of that place perform it. So there might be a couple of people that come in to assist, but the choir it's a community choir. They're not music readers. They all learned the graphic notation by heart. The four soloists, but they're not opera singers. There's a heavy metal singer, an improv singer. There is one opera singer, and there was a kind of more folk orientated Persian singer. And then the orchestra are not just classical musicians, they're pop. They can be any type of music as long as they've got a level of musicianship. They're all able to read the score. So its actual presentation is also quite political in that you bring people together who are interested in this concept. And I didn't really realize until this project that my notation is actually incredibly accessible to all kinds of musicians, and it's a possibility to bring people together in a way that perhaps other types of practices like Western notation don't. And it kind of blows apart that kind of mystery that people have around music notation. Like, if you don't read music, it's just like a whole bunch of stuff on the page. Whereas people, when they look at this notation, they kind of work out what's going on. It looks like it sounds sometimes.
Oh, brilliant. So when the work moves to Hamburg, there'll be another local community putting this together.
Correct. Yeah.
Okay. Wow, that's amazing.
I'd love to work with a refugee choir in Hamburg, but we're working towards just getting all the details together now.
I suppose, I look forward to seeing this opera perhaps being toured more and seeing all the different communities that get together around this work. Congratulations.
For our second intermission is a second work by Cat Hope, entitled Their Lives Are Stripped of Meaning, released in 2018. This recording is from the premiere performance of this work for voice, trumpet and electronics, here performed by Callum Goffreyer and Olivia Stahn.
So it's like coming out of this work in which you had such an inclusive and approach to it in terms of making and presentation. When it comes to other aspects of music making, whether it's in an institution, for example, like Monash University, or in a degree or some sort of curriculum, do you think that something kind of infrastructure, like having a quota in place to teach certain types of music to ensure that there's a level of diversity or inclusion, a useful tool to start that process?
Yeah, good question. I know that there's a lot of debate about quotas, but I did a lot of research before I introduced them. And I'm glad that I did. It was a bit painful at the start, but I found that just suggesting and encouraging was not doing the trick. And so it almost like you have to give the system a bit of a shock, like a one-up, like, and it's like, but there is none, or what about the masters, all these kind of things. And people work out once you get going that it's going to be okay. That there's still room to teach Beethoven, and not as much as there was before. It goes back to what I was saying before about someone has to stand aside. But it's usually okay. So I think that when you have such entrenched practices, you need to kind of somehow shock the system into a change. And these days, no one's around long enough to see something through over a 12-year period or whatever of constant, like, slowly steering the ship in another direction. So that's why I went that. I think it is important, and I do believe, the argument against quotas is basically one that says, well, there aren't any, but there are. Like, there are amazing amazing music by people from around the world or from within Australia and different cultural backgrounds. Women are great composers. There's lots of them. Why is it that you can't find them? That's a better question to ask, not do they exist. And I think quotas kind of deals with that problem. So it makes people look in a way that it's not right in their face. And so responding to quotas means you learn to look for things that perhaps you wouldn't normally know you should look for. That's my theory anyway. And so I would encourage anyone who's doing something like that. I mean, personally, I didn't always, I wasn't particularly inclusive in my own practice. I mean, in my own programming for the early days of Decibel, I mean, I didn't include lots of women. Just because I'm a woman composer, it didn't mean I knew lots of other women, and I guess I kind of looked at my own practices, and it's been quite challenging for me to change them as well, but it's been worth it, and I've found so much material I never would have found otherwise. So I guess I feel that I've really got something positive out of the experience of giving myself quotas, And I do think it's had a positive outcome at the university too.
I think it's a great tool, I suppose, or first step to begin to make the change, because you're right, trying to do things through suggestion doesn't always translate in an actually.
No, yeah, you're right. You know, some people really push back, and you know, if we talk about women, for example, quotas of women, some women don't want to be in a quota. I mean, I could totally understand that. I don't want to be your token woman because you need one. And I used to feel like that. But after a while, I started thought, you know what? I'm going to take it because it might be the only way I'm going to get it. Like, you know, I always just thought I wasn't good enough. I never really thought about this stuff, about why, you know, women weren't getting many opportunities. I think, you know, now I have a much more intersectional approach, and I realize it's not just women, and it's a whole bunch of other socioeconomic, cultural factors that come into play. And I'm learning all the time, you know, about how to do these things better. And I've made mistakes along the way, and hopefully as I get older, I make less of those. But I think that's okay. You know, that you need to make mistakes to learn. You're not going to get it right all the time, and I really do believe in risk taking. So that's a good learning space on its own right.
And what you mentioned before about, oh, there aren't any, or we can't find any. As you were saying that, I was thinking of a conversation I recently had with some musicians and artists, and we were talking about the electronic music world, some improvisation that's now integrating with classical music, or whatever classical music means now, but also the kind of new music avant-garde movement. I'm wondering why you think those particular movements, which came about in the 60s and the 70s, are still talked about as brand new, even though they're disciplines that have happened, you know, half a century ago, and why they still feel so exclusive for so many musicians practicing today.
What do you mean by exclusive in that context?
Well, when I show up to those gigs, they're always like the same people, the same contemporary new music experimental people, and increasingly less and less members of the public. It feels academic, I suppose, is one way to describe it.
It's like a ghetto, right? Like
yes.
So, and I use that word deliberately because they've been separated out from all the other music. And if, you know, there's a kind of hardcore group of people who support it, and, you know, and then there's all these other people that don't, and that creates this kind of weird vacuum effect where those just gets smaller and smaller and tighter, instead of expanding. And I do think a part of it is this marketing problem I was talking about before. But I think you're right. I mean, I'm always frustrated that people talk about experimental music as a movement in the 40s that started by John Cage. Like that, you know, that's quite a long time ago now. It's like 80 years ago. And yet still we look at that music as experimental. So still we look at 4 minutes 33 as a crazy thing. You know, I guess someone like Morton Feldman might be more accepted now than, you know, less revolutionary or crazy. But, you know, a lot of those experimental works from that period are still kind of in that little ghetto thing. And I spent a lot of time thinking about this and how, you know, and I talk about it like you with my colleagues, is it really that people just don't like it? Like, is melody and harmony so integral to music that as soon as you remove that, you've lost your audience already? So that's a challenging question for someone like me who doesn't, you know, design much melody or harmony or you know, my work. But I think I just think it's the way it's institutionalized. Music has been institutionalized along these very clearly defined silos. And when you have experimental art music, it's like a subculture of classical music or whatever, Western art music, whatever you might want to call it, rather than flourishing alongside it. It's like the poor dirty cousin that you don't want anyone to see, and only a few people are allowed in, you know, and that makes it look exclusive, whereas actually it's just sidelined. That's a huge challenge from an organization perspective, right? So I find, but I do believe that a lot of these problems are very much in Australia and are not so much happening the same way overseas. So, yeah, you said before that you're in the UK, so you know, yeah, you might be finding these tiny little, little subgroups. But I know with my group Decibel, when we left Perth and went and played in the south of Germany as part of the German radio new music series, they treated us like we were normal, like we were musicians in the Western art discipline. Whereas in Perth, we were treated like weirdos. And and I realized actually that, yeah, in Australia, we're still kind of figuring this stuff out. And in Europe, there's a lot more respect for innovation in music and art. And perhaps we need to understand that these kinds of experiments are necessary for the form to develop. And let's face it, most experimental music has never been huge. Like, we're looking at things retrospectively. Some artists look major because they published a lot and they pushed their stuff out there over and over again, and their reputation has probably grown over time, beyond their death, as have other composers that we know. So I think kind of contemporary new art music has a image problem, and I don't think it needs to be that way, because it's exciting. It's people really do. There is an audience for new and innovative things. But when we keep referencing ourselves and you get this kind of circular thing, that's a bit of it turns into like a little drain. And that's when you get this exclusive thing. But if we're open and willing to share these ideas and promote them as something worthwhile, exciting, and relevant, I think we have an opportunity to move out of that ghetto and into a different platform. And that's really up to those, I guess, how we sell ourselves as composers and musicians. And there's some great, I think the Australian Art Orchestra, well, maybe them as well, but the Australian Chamber Orchestra is a great example of who's managed to do that to some degree. I'm not sure about now so much, but I know over their career they play some pretty, out there things, as well as, more experimental things, but also the, international contemporary ensemble ICE in the US, and, legacy groups like Ensemble Moderne, Ensemble Contemporain. These are major groups, and they're playing music by living composers that is out there. So it doesn't have to be that way.
Exactly. It just, I suppose it is about a little bit about marketing, but also just
it is. It sounds horrible, doesn't it, to distill it down to that. But I do believe, we complain about being marketed to all the time, right? Like we hate it. But actually, popular music is excellent at that. We got a lot to learn from that. Commercial music, they've got that whole selling thing stitched up. I think we could learn quite a lot from that, and not expect that we will be supported all the time by some other means, because that means is falling away, I think. And but while it still exists, I guess it goes back to the political question. Damn it, I've got back there.
I suppose it's about communicating clearly what this music, or how this music.
Yeah, communicating it and celebrating it, not hiding it. Celebrating it and insisting on a space next to, major contemporary, major music ensembles. London Sinfonietta, the Barbicans, another great example of a place that puts all this stuff together. I think there's opportunities here, and we have to stop playing victim and get a little bit more strident in what we think will work. And in Australia, unfortunately, I think a lot of experimental artists feel pushed down, so it's very difficult to fight back when you have nothing, right? It's easy for me to say that. It's not that easy for a lot of musicians and ensembles to feel that they can ask or they can expect a certain type of role or position, I guess.
I suppose coming off that, I always ask this question at the end, which is, do you have any pieces of advice for any experimental artists or musicians, particularly those who who are kind of not categorized in anything that's traditional in how they can seek to make a broader impact for contemporary audiences?
I think my one word of advice would be collaboration. You're stronger in numbers. I would really encourage people to find other people like them, like-minded, and work together, support each other, hold each other up. It can be very isolating if you don't know where you fit and you're not part of a major movement or something that's been running the same way for the last 200 years or whatever. And that's coming from my own experience. That's what really helped me. You kind of, I guess I'm trying to avoid saying something like find your own people, because that creates the ghetto thing that you were talking about before. But actually, together you can make things happen. You can change. You grow confidence. You can experiment in an environment where you feel supported and you don't have to worry if anybody thinks it's silly or it doesn't work. You're going to make mistakes. So have people around you who will say, yeah, it didn't really work, but I reckon if we do this, we might, you need people around you. I think that's a really good way I think it's an important part of innovation, because you're more able to get momentum as a group, and you'll take turns in looking after each other. I think that would be my biggest piece of advice, and care for those relationships so that they flourish, and they'll last your whole lifetime if you tend to them. And then they will, even if you move on in different directions, they'll still be there to support you. And I think that's probably the main one. Otherwise, just remember that art is still incredibly important, whether we call it whatever it gets called, entertainment or art music or pop commercial music or whatever. The core of it is the same. It's an expression of who we are. And if we just remember that, there's lots of different ways to express ourselves. They're all valid. And sometimes we love it and share in it. Other times it's not for us, but that's a healthy sign. It's not a thing to be afraid of. Don't be afraid of criticism, and don't be afraid to give it, because that's the only way we'll grow and change. So if someone, sometimes, put yourself in opportunities where you are open to, there is debate or critique, because it might be hard at the start, but you will become stronger and you will grow as a result of that. I think we're living in a bit of a culture where everyone's too scared to say anything. So going back to the little collaborative group, that's a really great safe space for that type of critique.
No, I entirely agree, actually. And I actually think that's such a beautiful sentiment for us to come to an end in this wonderful conversation. So thank you so much for speaking with me and sparking all these ideas.
Thank you. Thanks for asking me and including me in your illustrious lineup. And good luck with your PhD.
So thank you so much again. And I hope you have a really wonderful evening and a walk. And thank you again so much for speaking with me. For everyone out there listening, thank you so much for listening to this episode, and apologies again about all those rustling microphone sounds. You can head out and check out information about Kat's work, details about her opera Speechless, which we touched on, as well as her research, below. You can also further support Kat by purchasing her music and albums, including her German Critics Prize winning monograph CD, Ephemeral Rivers, and I popped the link down there below for you to check that out too. Thanks for listening, and catch you all next time.